I was told the Custodes never repeat themselves. Doctrine was explicit, their speech is perfect, their commands singular. But the litany I transcribed said the same thing twice, word for word, and it referenced an action taken against the Imperium itself. My superior erased it from the record and told me repetition means the threat still exists. I signed the form that confirmed I'd misheard. The Vox sigil arrived in a lead-lined case with 3 seals I had never seen before. I was at my station when the courier entered, a servitor with augmetics that clicked against the stone floor in a rhythm I would later recognize as a countdown. It placed the case on my transcription desk without ceremony, extending a data slate that required my thumbprint, retinal scan, and a spoken confirmation of my designation, Palace Vox Archivist, 3rd grade, assigned to the Scriptorum Tertiaris, beneath the 13th sub-level of the Imperial Palace. I provided all 3. The servitor withdrew. The seals on the case bore marks I understood as authentication, blood, wax, and something that looked like gold but moved slightly in the candlelight, as though it remembered being liquid. The assignment slate was explicit. 1 watch cycle, the 9th solar vigil, beginning at the 3rd bell and concluding before the inner sanctum marked the shift's end. I would transcribe a litany transmitted through the sigil using the sacred quill reserved for custodian materials, a tool I had been trained to handle but never actually used. The litany was authorized by triple cipher. My task was preservation, not interpretation. When complete, I would seal the transcription in the amber vault and return the sigil to its case. The watch cycle would end. I would resume my ordinary duties. I believed this was an honor. The scriptorum was silent, except for the scratch of quills at distant desks and the perpetual hymn that played through vox grills in the ceiling, a devotional loop so constant it had become part of the architecture. My station occupied a niche carved from the palace's foundation stone, surrounded by shelves containing sanctioned texts and ledgers that documented prayers from every district of terror. The work was repetitive, comforting in its precision. Pilgrims sent devotions to the Emperor. We archived them. Errors were corrected. Doubt was excised. The Emperor's name appeared exactly as doctrine required, never abbreviated, never modified. This was how faith remained pure. I opened the case. The Vox sigil sat in velvet older than my bloodline. It was the size of my palm, gold-etched with patterns that hurt to focus on directly, circuits or script, or something that served both purposes simultaneously. 3 input points marked for blood, a single activation stud worn smooth by hands I would never know. I followed the instructions exactly, pricking my finger on the sanctified needle provided, touching each input point in sequence while reciting the clearance phrase I had memorized from the slate. The sigil warmed. A low hum emerged, felt more than heard, vibrating through the stone of my desk and into my bones. The conduit opened. Static first, the sound of vast distances compressed into a single channel. Then silence so complete it felt like pressure. Then the voice. It was not speech, as I understood speech. There was no inflection, no pause for breath, no variation in tone that might suggest emotion or emphasis. Each word arrived with identical weight, identical certainty, as though the speaker existed outside time and was simply allowing language to pass through them like water through a sieve. The voice identified itself by function, not name. Shield Captain, Inner Sanctum Watch, Clearance Authorization 99 Cardinal Sigma. It spoke of movement through spaces I had never known existed beneath the palace, corridors that intersected at angles geometry should not permit, chambers where the Emperor's presence was measured not in faith, but in radiation signatures that required shielding. I transcribed. The sacred quill moved across parchment in my hand, its nib fed by ink that glowed faintly in the candlelight, a mixture of blessed oils and something the Mechanicus provided in sealed vials we were forbidden to examine. My training took over. Each word was rendered in High Gothic with the appropriate honorifics. Custodian designations received full titles. Locations were marked with the sigils that indicated restricted knowledge. I did not interpret. I did not question. The litany was a protocol, a recitation of clearances and confirmations, the kind of administrative necessity that kept the palace functioning even when the universe beyond its walls descended into madness. Midway through the third section, a clause repeated. Not similar, identical. Word for word, honorific for honorific, down to the peculiar phrasing that referenced a prior action taken against an institution identified only by registry number and threat classification. The voice did not pause. It did not acknowledge the repetition. It simply continued, moving into clearances for the lower vaults, procedures for sealing breaches in the metaphysical barriers that protected the throne itself. But the repetition sat in my mind like a stone in still water, sending ripples I could not ignore. Custodian speech was doctrinally perfect. Redundancy implied error. Error implied flaw. Flaw was impossible. I transcribed the repetition exactly as it occurred. The litany continued for what felt like hours compressed into minutes. Time became slippery. I glanced at the chronometer on my desk twice, and both times it showed the same reading, the hand frozen between markers. The candles did not burn lower. The hymn in the ceiling repeated the same verse without progressing to the next. I told myself this was fatigue, the natural distortion that came from focusing too intently on sacred work. The quill never stopped moving. The ink never ran dry. Then the conduit closed. No warning. No formal termination. The voice simply stopped mid-syllable, cut off as cleanly as a blade through thread. The sigil cooled in an instant, the warmth leaching out of it so quickly I thought I felt frost on its surface. I sat in silence, quill hovering over parchment, waiting for the transmission to resume. It did not. The chronometer hand jerked forward, lurching through lost minutes to catch up with reality. The candles guttered and stabilized. The hymn progressed to its next verse. I looked up at the bell marker above my station. The third bell had not yet tolled. The watch cycle should have ended. The inner sanctum's chime was precise, regulated by mechanisms blessed by the Mechanicus and monitored by servitors whose entire existence was dedicated to timekeeping. But the bells remained silent. I waited, counting heartbeats, each one louder in my ears than it should have been. The transcription lay complete before me, still glowing faintly, the ink not yet fully dried. I checked the chronometer again. The hand showed the watch cycle had exceeded its duration by 17 minutes. 17 minutes that had occurred without bells. I told myself this was an error to be corrected later, a minor calibration issue that would be reported to the proper authorities and resolved through the appropriate channels. The palace was vast beyond comprehension. Errors occurred. They were always found. They were always fixed. This was how order was maintained. I sealed the transcription in the amber vault using the cipher provided on the instruction slate, placed the Vox sigil back in its case, and returned both to the courier station for retrieval. My hands did not shake. My breathing remained steady. I had completed my assignment. The litany existed now, preserved in materials designed to outlast empires, stored in a vault that would not open again without authorization from sources I would never know. The work had outlived the time meant to contain it. I did not realize then that escape was already impossible. The days that followed should have been ordinary. I returned to my usual duties, cataloging pilgrim hymns, correcting devotional errors, maintaining the vast archive of prayers that flowed into the palace from across Terra and beyond. The work was meditative. Each hymn followed strict templates. The emperor's name appeared in prescribed forms. Deviations were noted, corrected, and filed in ledgers that tracked the slow evolution of faith across centuries. This was my purpose. This was where I belonged. But the repeated clause would not leave my mind. I did not speak of it. Palace doctrine was explicit about information containment. What one learned in service remained in service. To discuss restricted materials with anyone lacking proper clearance was not merely a violation of protocol, it was a spiritual corruption, a wound in the integrity of the Imperium itself. I had been taught this from my first day as an initiate, when I was young enough to believe that rules existed to protect me rather than to protect something larger than myself. The Adeptus Custodes were axioms made flesh. This was fundamental truth. They did not err. They did not require oversight. They were not soldiers or servants, or even warriors in the way the Astartes were warriors. They were the Emperor's will given form, perfection incarnate, living proof that the Imperium still possessed something flawless in a galaxy defined by corruption and decay. To question them was to question reality itself. I had been raised on stories of their deeds, though the stories were always distant, filtered through layers of myth and doctrine. A custodian had once stood alone against a demonic incursion for 40 days while the palace's defenses were repaired. A custodian had executed an entire cardinal's retinue when a single member was found to carry a microscopic taint, the action taken so swiftly that none of the victims understood they were dying. A custodian had walked into the webway breach and emerged 3 years later without aging, without explanation, without requiring absolution because his actions required none. These were not horror stories, they were catechism. They taught us that perfection was real, that purity could be maintained, that somewhere in the Imperium there existed beings who could not be corrupted or compromised or made to doubt. The Custodes were not distant because they were arrogant. They were distant because their presence would unmake us. We were not worthy to stand in their sight. This distance was mercy. I believed this absolutely. My station was in the Scriptorum Tertiarus, a vast hall carved from the palace's lower foundations where 300 archivists worked in perpetual silence beneath vaulted ceilings lost in shadow. The space was ancient, its walls bearing inscriptions in languages that predated the Imperium, prayers to an emperor who had not yet claimed godhood. Candles provided the only light, thousands of them arranged in patterns that formed devotional sigils when viewed from above, maintained by menials who replaced them in absolute silence according to rituals older than memory. We worked alone but together, each archivist isolated in their niche but connected through the shared purpose of preservation. I knew my colleagues only by designation and the sound of their quills. We did not speak. We did not look at each other. The hymn in the ceiling provided all the human connection we required. This was where I had spent 8 years of my life, transcribing prayers and correcting errors, a small perfect gear in a machine so vast its purpose could never be fully comprehended. I had no family beyond the Scriptorum. I had no desires beyond competence. I had been selected at age 12 from a scholar on the palace's upper levels, chosen for steady hands and the ability to sit motionless for hours without discomfort. I had been blessed, but now, as I worked, I found my attention drifting. The repeated clause had contained a registry number. I knew I should not think about it. I knew that curiosity was the first symptom of corruption, the opening through which doubt entered and faith leaked out. But the number sat in my memory with uncomfortable clarity, and I realized with quiet horror that I could still see the exact way the quill had formed each digit, could still hear the voice speaking it with that terrible certainty. I began to notice patterns in the materials I processed. A hymn from a shrine on the palace's 73rd level referenced a district that no longer appeared in current maps. A devotional from a cardinal's household mentioned a ceremonial chamber I could not locate in any architectural record. Small inconsistencies, easily dismissed, the kind of thing that occurred naturally as the palace evolved over millennia. Buildings were demolished, districts were renamed. History accumulated like sediment, burying its own foundations. But the errors all shared a quality I had not noticed before. They referenced things that had been removed, not things that had changed. The hymn did not say the district was renamed. It simply pretended the district had never existed. The devotional did not note the chamber was sealed. It described it as though it were still in use, still accessible, still real. I corrected the errors as I had been trained to do. I aligned them with current doctrine. The district was removed. The chamber was omitted. The prayers were resubmitted to their sources with annotations explaining the necessary changes. This was standard practice. This was how memory was kept pure. But I began to understand that I was not correcting errors. I was participating in erasure. The realization came slowly, not as sudden revelation but as weight accumulating over days. Each correction removed something. Each alignment with doctrine meant acknowledging that the past had been wrong, or that what had existed once no longer deserved to exist in memory. The process was gentle, surgical, designed to produce compliance without resistance. I signed forms after each correction, affirming that the changes improved accuracy, that doctrine was more reliable than individual recollection, that the Imperium was strengthened when all voices sang the same hymn. I signed because refusing to sign was unthinkable. 3 weeks after transcribing the litany, I was summoned by my superior. Logister Vrain occupied an office on the sublevel above mine, a chamber larger than my entire living quarters, its walls lined with ledgers bound in human skin that documented 10,000 years of palace administration. She was old beyond measure, her body sustained by juvenile treatments that had left her skin translucent and her eyes the color of old parchment. She had served in the scriptorum for longer than I had been alive. She had clearances I would never possess. She spoke rarely, and when she did, her words carried the weight of authority that came from absolute proximity to truth. I stood before her desk while she reviewed my transcription of the litany. She did not invite me to sit. The amber vault had been opened in my absence, the transcription removed and laid out on her desk beneath a reading lens that magnified each word to monstrous clarity. I watched her fingers trace the lines, moving with the same measured precision I had seen in every palace official, a gesture so rehearsed it seemed more like prayer than reading. She paused at the repeated clause. "You transcribed this exactly," she said. "It was not a question." "Yes, Logister." "You understood the material was restricted." "Yes, Logister." "You recognized the repetition." I hesitated. This was the first moment in which I could have denied it, could have claimed distraction or fatigue or simple failure to notice, but lying to a superior within the palace was worse than heresy. It was structural collapse. It was removing a stone from the foundation and pretending the weight above would not shift. "Yes, Logister." She nodded slowly, as though I had confirmed something she already knew. Her fingers moved to a drawer in her desk, withdrawing a stylus I recognized as an erasure tool, its tip containing acids that could dissolve the sacred ink without damaging the parchment beneath. She positioned it above the transcription. "Context is dangerous," she said. "The Adeptus Custodes operate within protective paradoxes. Their actions are always correct. This correctness does not require explanation. When we preserve their words, we preserve their authority. When we preserve their authority without context, we protect the Imperium from questions it cannot survive asking." She began to erase. The repeated clause vanished. Not just the second occurrence, but both instances, the acid eating through the ink with surgical precision, removing not just the words but the space they had occupied, the parchment seeming to close around the absence like flesh around a wound. I watched entire sections disappear. The registry number, the threat classification, the reference to prior action. What remained was a litany stripped clean, a series of clearances and confirmations that said nothing, meant nothing, revealed nothing. "You will submit this revised version to the vault," Vrain said. "You will amend your memory ledger to reflect that the original transcription contained errors that required correction. You will note that these errors were the result of auditory distortion in the Vox conduit and do not reflect failings in your transcription technique." She pushed the amended transcription toward me. The parchment still glowed faintly, but the light was dimmer now, as though the removal had drained something essential from it. "The Custodes do not repeat themselves," she continued. "If the transmission suggested repetition, it is because your understanding is incomplete. This is not failure. This is the correct relationship between the infinite and the finite. You recorded infinity. I have returned it to a form we can survive comprehending." I took the transcription. My hands remained steady. "Do you understand?" Vrain asked. "Yes, Logister." "Do you have questions?" I should have said no. I should have accepted the correction and returned to my station and allowed the explanation to settle over my thoughts like dust over something buried. but the registry number remained in my memory with terrible clarity, and I found myself speaking before I could stop. The clause referenced an action taken against the Imperium itself. Vrain's expression did not change. Clarify. The phrasing. It stated that the Custodes had neutralized an imperial institution, not an enemy, not a heretic organization, something that belonged to the Imperium. And this troubles you. It was not a question, but I answered anyway. The Custodes protect the Imperium. They cannot act against it. The Custodes protect the Emperor, Vrana corrected. Her voice remained calm, gentle even, as though she were explaining something obvious to a child. The Imperium exists to serve the Emperor. When the Imperium's existence threatens the Emperor's survival, the Custodes correct the threat. This is the protective paradox. They preserve the whole by removing the part that has become cancerous. The part may be loyal. It may be pure. It may be essential. None of this matters if its continued existence introduces risk. She leaned forward slightly, and I saw something in her eyes that might have been pity or might have been recognition. You are asking whether the Custodes can kill the innocent. The answer is yes. They can and do. This is not cruelty. This is function. A surgeon removes healthy tissue to reach a tumor. The tissue has done nothing wrong. It simply exists in the wrong place at the wrong time. The Custodes are the Imperium's surgeons. We are the tissue. I said nothing. There was nothing to say. She had not revealed forbidden knowledge. She had simply named the shape of something I had already begun to understand. You will amend your ledger, she said again. You will submit the revised transcription. You will not speak of this conversation. These are not requests. Yes, Logister. She dismissed me with a gesture. I left her office carrying the amended transcription, my mind already composing the lies I would write into my own memory ledger, the careful construction of doubt about my own accuracy, the humble admission that I had been unworthy of the task and was grateful for correction. I wrote the lies that evening at my station, each word carved into official record with the same sacred quill I had used to transcribe the litany. I described auditory distortion that had not occurred. I acknowledged limitations that had not existed. I thanked the Logister for her wisdom and mercy. The lies became truth the moment they were sealed in my ledger, supplanting memory, overwriting experience with doctrine. This was how the palace functioned. This was how certainty was maintained, not through force but through gentle, constant pressure, the weight of authority applied so carefully that compliance felt like revelation. I signed the amendment with my own hand. The consequence was minor but permanent. I had authorized the first erasure of my own experience. I had chosen to doubt my senses rather than doubt the system that required my senses to be wrong. Faith was no longer something I possessed. It was something I performed. But performance was sufficient. No one could see the difference. The palace shifted around me after that, or perhaps I simply began noticing what had always been there. My reassignment came without explanation, delivered by servitor during the afternoon devotional. A new station, deeper within the scriptorum's foundations, closer to the sub-level archives that adjoined the inner walls. The announcement framed this as recognition of competence, an elevation despite my errors, proof that correction had improved rather than diminished me. I gathered my personal effects, a thumb-worn copy of the Lectitio Divinitatus, a stylus my mother had given me before she disappeared into the palace's lower manufactories, 3 robes in progressively worse repair, and followed the servitor down. The corridors narrowed. I had worked in the scriptorum for 8 years without truly noticing its architecture. The halls were simply the spaces between destinations, neutral and functional, no different from the veins that carried blood through a body. But as I descended, following the servitor's clicking footsteps, I began to perceive weight. The ceilings lowered. The walls closed in. The stone itself felt denser, pressed by the immeasurable mass of the palace above, every corridor a tunnel carved through compressed history. The air tasted different down here, thinner, filtered. I could hear machinery behind the walls, the deep rhythmic throb of ventilation systems and coolant pumps, the palace's metabolic processes made audible. The hymn from the ceiling grills had changed to a different verse, one I did not recognize, its cadence slower and more somber, as though preparing those who descended for a form of worship that required endurance rather than joy. We passed through 3 checkpoints, each requiring verification of my reassignment orders and biometric scans that seemed unnecessarily thorough for an archivist moving between workstations. The guards at each checkpoint wore uniforms I recognized as Palace Watch, mortals who had served with sufficient distinction to earn duty within the Emperor's home. They did not speak to me. They did not acknowledge me beyond the minimum required by protocol. Their eyes were flat and careful, trained to see without observing, to witness without remembering. At the 3rd checkpoint, one of them looked at my face for a moment too long before waving me through. My new station occupied a niche carved directly from the palace's foundation stone, a small chamber barely large enough for a desk, a chair, and shelving for essential texts. The walls bore marks I initially mistook for decoration before realizing they were tool scars, ancient cuts made by whatever machines had first carved these spaces during the palace's construction 30,000 years ago. The stone was black here, not the grey granite of the upper levels, some deeper stratum pressed smooth by time and weight. A single candle provided light, its flame unnaturally steady, protected from drafts by a glass shield etched with micro-prayers. The hymn played through a grill in the ceiling, but the audio was distorted, as though the signal had traveled too far from its source and lost coherence along the way. I could hear words beneath words, previous recordings bleeding through, decades or centuries of devotional loops layered into a single impossible sound. I sat at my desk and began unpacking my materials. The work assigned to me was similar to my previous duties, but focused exclusively on materials originating from the inner sanctum and its adjacent districts. Prayers from the custodian's own chapels, devotional transmissions from the Sisters of Silence, navigational logs from vessels that traveled the palace's subterranean transit system. Everything was restricted. Everything required clearances. Everything was to be catalogued, preserved, and sealed without interpretation. I should have felt honored. This was access few archivists ever received. But as I began processing the first batch of materials, I felt only a crawling awareness that I was being moved closer to something I should not see. The servitor departed without instructions. I was alone in my niche, surrounded by stone and silence, and the weight of everything above me. I worked. Hours passed, measured only by the candle's slow consumption and the chronometer on my desk, its mechanisms clicking with the same rhythmic precision as the servitor's joints. I transcribed prayers that were almost mathematical in their precision, devotionals that read more like engineering specifications than expressions of faith. The custodian's language was spare and exact, every word bearing weight, no redundancy, no elaboration, no comfort. I began to notice the architecture of my confinement. The niche had no door, only an archway that opened onto the corridor beyond. I could leave whenever I wished, but the corridor itself led nowhere I was authorized to go. To my left, it terminated at a sealed adamantine barrier marked with clearance sigils I did not possess. To my right, it extended beyond sight, curving gently, its walls lined with similar niches where I occasionally glimpsed other archivists at work, silent figures bent over their desks, faces hidden by candlelight and shadow. We did not acknowledge each other, we had not been introduced. We existed in adjacent isolation, close enough to sense the presence of others, but separated by protocol and the knowledge that conversation would serve no purpose. I focused on my work and tried not to think about the distance between my niche and the surface. The tonnage of stone and steel and blessed ceramite pressing down from above, the palace's mass made visceral. On my 3rd day in the new station, I heard movement. Not footsteps exactly, something more deliberate, measured in a way that suggested weight and control rather than simple ambulation. The sound came from beyond the adamantine barrier, resonating through the stone itself, a deep, rhythmic presence that I felt in my chest before I heard it with my ears. I looked up from my transcription. The corridor was empty. The other archivists continued their work without interruption. The candle flame remained steady. The movement continued, closer. I had the sudden, absolute certainty that something was approaching the barrier from the other side, something that belonged to spaces I would never see, descending from or ascending to duties I could not imagine. The sound was precise, perfectly regular, each impact of weight against stone timed with mechanical exactness. The barrier remained sealed. But through it, barely visible, I saw light shift. Not illumination passing through or around the adamantine, but the metal itself responding to presence, its surface rippling like liquid for a fraction of a second, distorting and then resolving. In that distortion, I glimpsed gold. Not reflected, not adorning. Gold as structure, as form, as the essential material from which something was made. It passed behind the barrier, visible only as displacement, a negative space of such absolute certainty that everything around it seemed tentative by comparison. Then, it was gone. The corridor returned to stillness. The other archivists had not looked up. The hymn continued its layered loop. My candle had burned lower than it should have in the time I had been watching, minutes somehow compressed or expanded, duration made unreliable. I looked down at my transcription and found I had stopped mid-word, the quill hovering above parchment, a drop of ink suspended on its tip. My hand was shaking. I completed the word. I continued my work. But I understood now that the Custodes were not distant guardians watching over the palace from some elevated position of authority and remove. They were everywhere, embedded within the palace's structure, moving through spaces that intersected with ours, but remained fundamentally separate, present without being seen, observing without being witnessed. The walls were not barriers. They were permeable boundaries. The palace was not a fortress with the Custodes standing watch at its gates. It was their domain, and we existed within it only by permission so absolute we mistook it for safety. I returned to my transcription, but the work felt different now. Every prayer I catalogued, every devotional I preserved, I understood as something that passed through layers of judgment I could not see. The Custodes were not reading these materials. They already knew their contents. My labor was not preservation. It was verification. I was checking the Imperium's work against the standard of perfection that walked unseen in the corridors beyond my sight. The pressure I felt was not paranoia. It was the correct response to being observed by something that could not be deceived. That night, unable to sleep in my dormitory cell, I found myself thinking about the registry number from the litany. The number Logister Vrain had erased. The number that remained in my memory with perfect clarity despite my amended ledger claiming I had misheard it. I knew I should not investigate. I knew that curiosity about restricted materials was the first step toward corruption, that questions about custodian operations were not merely forbidden but spiritually dangerous, openings through which doubt could enter and faith could leak out. The proper response was prayer and obedience. The proper response was accepting that some knowledge was meant only for those capable of surviving its weight, but I also knew that the repetition in the litany had been real. I knew that something had been neutralized, not because it was corrupt, but because it existed in the wrong place at the wrong time. And I knew that Logister Vrain had called us tissue, expendable and replaceable, removed without cruelty when the surgeon's blade required it. I lay on my cot in darkness, listening to the dormitory's ambient sounds, breathing, prayer whispers, the occasional sob quickly stifled, and I allowed myself to imagine what institution could be loyal and pure and essential and still require neutralization by the Adeptus Custodes. The answer arrived with terrible clarity. Any of them, all of them, the ecclesiarchy, the administratum, the mechanicus, the navy, even the Inquisition itself, nothing was exempt. Nothing was protected by its own purity. The Custodes did not serve the Imperium's institutions, they served the Emperor. And if the Emperor's survival required sacrificing the very structures designed to protect him, then those structures would be sacrificed without hesitation, without explanation, without record. This was the protective paradox Vrain had named. This was the horror I had begun to comprehend. The Custodes were terrifying not because they might be wrong, but because they were right according to a logic that superseded morality, loyalty, and even faith. They operated at a level of abstraction where individual lives and institutional sanctity were simply variables in an equation whose solution was the Emperor's continued existence. We existed to serve the Emperor. The Custodes existed to ensure that service never became a threat. I stared at the ceiling of my cell and tried to pray. The words came automatically, rehearsed since childhood, familiar as breathing. But beneath them, I felt something colder settling into my understanding. The prayer was not communication, it was performance. It was proof that I remained compliant, that doubt had not yet progressed to dissent, that I could still be trusted to function within the system that had begun to reveal its true shape. I prayed until sleep came, and in my dreams I heard the litany repeating, the voice speaking with that terrible certainty, the clauses cycling endlessly without variation, without error, without mercy. The repetition was not malfunction, it was emphasis. It was the Custodes ensuring that even in transmission, even filtered through the limitations of human comprehension, the core truth would survive. They had done this before. They would do it again. The institutions would continue. The Imperium would endure. And somewhere in the palace's depths, in chambers I would never see, decisions were being made about what needed to be removed next. I woke to the third bell and returned to my station. The work continued. Nothing had changed except my understanding. And understanding, I was beginning to realize, was its own form of punishment. The patterns emerged slowly, accumulating over weeks like sediment settling in still water. I processed devotionals from districts that appeared in no current maps. I catalogued prayers referencing ceremonial chambers that official architectural records claimed had never existed. I archived navigational logs describing transit routes through sections of the palace that were listed as sealed foundation stone, inaccessible since the Unification Wars. Each anomaly was small, easily dismissed as clerical error or historical confusion. But they accumulated. The work itself became ritual. I would arrive at my station before the third bell, light the candle using the blessed matches stored in their silver case, and arrange my materials with the precision I had been taught. Quill, ink, parchment, reading lens, correction stylus, everything in its proper place. Everything aligned with the desk's edges. The prayer whispered before beginning. The first stroke of the quill across parchment, testing consistency and flow. Then transcription, hours of it, my hand moving in patterns so familiar they required no conscious thought, the sacred ink flowing through the quill's nib, forming letters in High Gothic according to templates refined over millennia. The scratch of quill against parchment becoming the only sound beyond the distorted hymn and my own breathing. But now I noticed what I was transcribing. A prayer from the Chapel of the Third Testimony referenced an altar that had been removed, not destroyed or relocated, removed, as though it had been edited from reality itself. The grammar suggested the altar had once existed, but the tense was wrong, caught between past and conditional, language failing to describe something that had been retroactively unmade. A devotional from a cardinal's household mentioned a benediction performed by a saint whose name appeared in no registry of the blessed dead. The prayer was dated, authenticated, sealed with all proper authority, but the saint it referenced had been erased so thoroughly that only the devotional remained as evidence of their existence. A navigational log described a transit through the palace's subterranean rail system, routine except that it passed through a station that official records showed had never been built. The coordinates were precise. The timestamps were exact. The station was listed simply as Tertius 17, decommissioned for preventative purposes. I corrected each anomaly as I had been trained to do. I aligned the prayers with current doctrine, removed the impossible references, adjusted the language to match authorized templates. I signed forms after each correction, affirming that the changes improved accuracy, that history was less reliable than present truth, that the past could be wrong about itself. But I began to understand that I was not correcting errors. I was completing erasures that had begun elsewhere, in places and by means I could not imagine. Someone had removed the altar. Someone had eliminated the saint. Someone had decommissioned the station. My labor was simply ensuring that memory conformed to those decisions, that the Imperium's official record did not contain references to things that were no longer permitted to have existed. This was not falsification. This was consensus. This was how the Imperium maintained coherence across 10,000 years of history, too vast for any single mind to comprehend. The past was constantly being refined, corrected, improved, not to deceive, but to protect. I told myself this was necessary. I told myself this was holy. But the registry number from the litany remained in my memory, and I could not escape the understanding that somewhere in the documents I processed, I might encounter evidence of whatever had been neutralized. Some institution that had once existed, once served, once believed itself essential to the Emperor's will before the Custodes decided otherwise. On my 17th day in the new station, I found it. Not directly, not as confession or explanation, but as absence. A prayer from the Librarius Obscurus referenced a sub-department whose registry number matched the one I had transcribed. The department's function was not specified, its personnel were not named. But the prayer was dated 3 years before the litany I had transcribed, and it referred to the department as operational, active, essential to palace security. 3 years later, the litany had referenced its neutralization. I sat at my desk, quill frozen above parchment, staring at the prayer. My hands had begun to shake. I set the quill down carefully and pressed my palms flat against the desk surface, forcing stillness. The department had been loyal, it had served the palace, it had been essential to security, and it had been removed. I did not know what the department had done. I did not know what threat it posed, but I understood with absolute clarity that its loyalty and its essentiality had not protected it. The Custodes had acted. The department had been erased. And now I was participating in that erasure by correcting prayers that referenced its existence, by aligning memory with the decision that had already been made. I looked up from my desk and found myself staring at the adamantine barrier down the corridor, the sealed entrance to spaces I would never see. Behind that barrier, the Custodes moved through their duties. Behind that barrier, decisions were made. Behind that barrier, the Imperium was being constantly pruned, trimmed, perfected through removal. I returned to the prayer and made the correction. I removed the department's registry number. I adjusted the phrasing to suggest the prayer had been addressed to palace security in general rather than any specific sub-department. I signed the form. I sealed the correction in my ledger. The erasure was complete. The department had been removed from reality, from memory, from the Imperium's official understanding of its own structure. It existed now only in my mind, in a registry number I was forbidden to speak, connected to a litany I no longer possessed. I should have felt horror. I should have felt revulsion. But what I felt instead was a cold comprehension settling over me like a shroud. This was not aberration. This was function. This was how the palace survived, not through permanence, but through constant correction, not through preservation, but through careful, surgical removal of anything that introduced instability. The Custodes were not guardians of tradition. They were the Imperium's immune system, and I had just participated in the destruction of a cell deemed cancerous. The work continued. I processed more prayers, corrected more anomalies, signed more forms. Each correction felt easier than the last. The horror was fading, replaced by something worse: acceptance. I had become complicit, and compliance had become indistinguishable from duty. The first audit arrived without warning, announced only by the presence of a logister I did not recognize standing in the archway of my niche. He was younger than Vrain, but carried himself with the same careful precision, his movements economical and exact, his face trained into an expression of benign authority that revealed nothing. He did not introduce himself. He simply placed a data slate on my desk and informed me that my recent work would be reviewed. "Standard procedure," he said. "All archivists in proximity to restricted materials undergo periodic verification. You will continue your duties while the review is conducted." I nodded. I did not ask questions. I had learned that questions were interpreted as uncertainty, and uncertainty required correction. He remained in the archway, watching me work. His presence was not hostile or suspicious. It was simply there, persistent and unyielding, a weight pressing against the edges of my concentration. I forced myself to continue transcribing, to maintain the rhythm of quill across parchment, to give no indication that being observed disturbed me. But I felt his attention like pressure against my skin, constant and inescapable. Every stroke of the quill was now visible to someone who possessed clearances I did not have, who understood the materials I processed in ways I could not imagine, who might see patterns in my corrections that revealed too much about what I had begun to understand. After 3 hours, he departed without explanation. The data slate remained on my desk, its screen blank, its purpose unclear. I did not touch it. I completed my shift and returned to my dormitory, moving through the palace's corridors with careful neutrality, my face trained into the same expression of dutiful compliance I saw on every other mortal who served within these walls. The dormitory was crowded that evening, more crowded than usual, bodies pressed close in the long chamber lined with cots. I found my assigned space and lay down fully clothed, staring at the ceiling while conversations whispered around me in the darkness. Palace servants discussing shift assignments, menials sharing rumors about disturbances in the lower manufactories, a ministorum priest leading a prayer circle in the corner, their voices rising and falling in familiar cadences. No one mentioned the audits, no one spoke of the Logister's visits, but I felt tension in the room, subtle but pervasive, the awareness that something had shifted in the palace's normal rhythms. I closed my eyes and tried to sleep, but found myself listening instead to the ambient sounds: breathing, prayer, the occasional sob. Sounds of humanity compressed into confined space, forced into proximity without comfort, maintained at the minimum necessary for function. A voice broke through the background murmur, closer than the others. "You're new to the lower stations." I opened my eyes. The speaker occupied the cot next to mine, a woman perhaps a decade older than me, her face lined with exhaustion and her eyes carrying the flat, careful look of someone who had learned not to see too much. I recognized her designation tattoo as archival, though not from my section. 17 days, I said quietly. "You'll adjust. Everyone does." She paused. "Or they don't, and they're reassigned." "Reassigned where?" She did not answer immediately. When she spoke again, her voice was even quieter. "Does it matter? Reassignment means you weren't suitable for the work. The palace always finds use for unsuitable personnel. The manufactories, the waste reclamation systems, the meat processing facilities. Service continues, just in different forms." I said nothing. She rolled onto her side, facing away from me. "Don't ask questions," she added. "Don't notice patterns. Don't remember details that aren't part of your immediate task. The work is sufficient. Everything else is corruption waiting to take root." She fell silent after that, or pretended to sleep. I lay in the darkness and understood that she had recognized something in me. Some sign of the understanding I had begun to develop, some indication that I was noticing what should remain invisible. Her warning was mercy, delivered in the only way permitted within the palace as advice, not conspiracy, individual wisdom shared without coordination or intent. I took the warning seriously. When I returned to my station the next day, I forced myself to work without thinking, to transcribe without comprehension, to process materials as pure data rather than meaning. The quill moved, the ink flowed, the corrections were made. I signed the forms automatically, my signature becoming a gesture emptied of decision. But I could not stop noticing. The Vox echoes began 3 days after the audit. I would finish speaking a prayer aloud as part of the transcription process, verifying pronunciation and cadence, and my own voice would return to me seconds later, delayed and distorted, as though it had traveled through vast distances before finding its way back. The effect was subtle enough that I thought initially it was simply acoustic properties of the stone, sound bouncing through the palace's foundations in ways I did not understand. But the echoes were too exact. They preserved not just words but inflection, breath patterns, the small involuntary sounds I made while working. They arrived with perfect timing, spaced precisely to create maximum disorientation, my voice overlapping with itself in ways that made it difficult to know which sounds were immediate and which were recorded. I was being monitored, not by human observers, but by machines embedded in the stone itself, recording everything, analyzing everything, searching for patterns that might indicate deviation from acceptable thought. I began to edit my speech, carefully pruning anything that might suggest doubt or uncertainty. I prayed aloud more frequently, filling the silence with devotional recitations that demonstrated correct faith. I made my thoughts external and visible, performing compliance so thoroughly that surveillance would find nothing to correct. But this meant surrendering privacy of thought. It meant policing myself before the palace could police me. It meant becoming the observer and the observed simultaneously, watching my own mind for signs of corruption, correcting my own deviations before they could be detected. The process was exhausting. I felt myself fracturing, attention divided between the work and the performance of the work, between thinking and monitoring thought. Each day required more energy to maintain the facade. Each night, I collapsed into my cot with the awareness that I had spent the day performing a version of myself designed to pass inspection. And still, the audits continued. Different logisters arriving at random intervals, never the same one twice, each conducting reviews without explanation or conclusion. They would watch, they would depart. The data slate on my desk accumulated files I was not permitted to read. On my 34th day in the lower station, my colleague disappeared. I did not know her name. I had never spoken to her directly, but she occupied the niche 3 positions down from mine, and I had grown accustomed to the sound of her quill, the particular rhythm of her transcription work, the soft whisper of prayer she murmured between tasks. The sounds were comforting in their consistency, proof that I was not alone in my labor, that others endured the same duties without complaint. The sounds stopped midway through the afternoon shift. I looked up from my work. The corridor was silent except for the hymn and the distant throb of machinery. The other archivists continued their tasks without interruption. No alarm had sounded, no announcement had been made. But when I glanced down the corridor toward her niche, I saw only emptiness, her desk bare, her candle extinguished, her materials removed as though she had never existed. I returned to my transcription. My hands were shaking. I set the quill down and pressed my palms flat against the desk, forcing stillness. I waited for explanation, for announcement, for some acknowledgement that a person who had occupied the same space as me moments ago was now absent. Nothing came. The shift ended. I completed my work and sealed my materials and returned to the dormitory. Her cot was empty, the thin mattress stripped, the space already reassigned to someone new whose face I did not recognize and whose name I did not learn. In the morning, I checked the administrative logs accessible through the data slate at my station. Her designation appeared with a single notation, reassigned for continued service. Location, classified. Clearance, Tertiary 9 required for access. I did not have Tertiary 9 clearance. I would never have Tertiary 9 clearance. The woman who had warned me noticed my distraction during the evening prayer. She said nothing, but when the prayer ended and the lights dimmed, she spoke quietly from her cot. Don't search for her, don't ask questions. She made an error, or she noticed something, or she simply became unsuitable. The why doesn't matter. The palace corrected the issue. Service continues. What kind of error? I whispered. Any kind. All kinds. It's not measured in severity. It's measured in risk. A single misplaced comma in a transcription can indicate degraded attention. Degraded attention indicates potential for larger failures. Potential for failure indicates unsuitability. The palace doesn't wait for failures to manifest. It prevents them. She's not dead? The woman was silent for a long moment. She's serving, somewhere, in some capacity. Whether she's alive depends on how you define life. Whether it matters depends on how you define purpose. I closed my eyes and tried not to imagine the forms of service that might persist after identity was removed, the ways the palace might extract value from bodies that no longer required consciousness or will. The next day, I returned to work and found a fresh blood mark on my Vox sigil case. The case sat on my desk exactly where I had left it, sealed and locked, its lead lining intact. But the topmost seal bore a new authentication mark pressed into the wax with a thumbprint I recognized. Not by the pattern of horals, I had never seen my colleague's hands closely enough to memorize such details, but by the size and pressure, the small hesitation visible in the wax where the thumb had lingered a fraction too long. She had touched this case. Recently, after her reassignment, after her disappearance, I stared at the seal, my heart hammering against my ribs. The case should not have been moved. It should not have been accessed. Its contents were restricted to my use alone, authorized only for the single transmission I had transcribed weeks ago, but someone had opened it. Someone had used it. Someone had pressed their thumb against the seal to mark their access. I checked the administrative logs. No entry, no notation. No record of the case being requisitioned or my colleague being granted temporary clearance. The access was unauthorized. Or it was authorized at a level that did not require documentation. Or documentation existed in spaces I could not reach. I sat at my desk and tried to work, but my attention kept returning to the seal, to the blood mark that was and was not my colleague's, to the questions I could not ask without revealing that I had noticed something I should have remained blind to. That evening, I received a summons. The servitor arrived during my meal, extending the data slate with mechanical precision. The message was brief. Report to Sub-Archive Tertiary Sigma for material verification. Immediate compliance required. I had never heard of Sub-Archive Tertiary Sigma. It did not appear in any organizational chart I had access to, but the summons carried proper authentication codes and bore Logister Vrain's seal. I followed the servitor down. The corridors descended farther than I had ever traveled, past checkpoints I did not recognize, through sections of the palace that felt older and stranger, the stone worn smooth by passage beyond counting, the air thick with age. The hymn from the ceiling grills had degraded into pure static, barely recognizable as sound, as though the distance from its source had stripped away everything but noise. We passed through a final checkpoint where the guard examined my face with uncomfortable intensity before waving me through. The corridor beyond terminated at a simple door, unmarked, its surface bearing only a single icon, the eagle of the Imperium overlaid with a numeral I did not recognize. The servitor departed. I stood alone before the door, understanding that stepping through would change something fundamental, that whatever lay beyond would not permit retreat into comfortable ignorance. I opened the door. The chamber beyond was small, barely larger than my niche, dominated by a single table. Logister Vrain sat on one side. On the other, standing, was a custodian. I had never seen one directly. Distance had been mercy, Vrain had told me. Proximity would unmake us. But here was a custodian, standing 4 paces away, gold armor catching candlelight in ways that seemed wrong, as though the light bent around him rather than reflecting, as though reality itself made accommodations for his presence. He was not facing me. His attention was focused on something on the table, a data slate, or perhaps the same amber vault that contained my transcription. I could not see clearly. My vision had narrowed, pressure building behind my eyes, the same visceral wrongness I had felt when glimpsing him through the adamantine barrier, magnified now by direct proximity. Vrain gestured to a chair. I sat, my movements automatic, my body responding to authority while my mind struggled to process what I was seeing. The custodian spoke. The voice was the same as the litany. No inflection, no variation. Each word arriving with identical weight, certainty without emphasis, command without explanation. The transcription was accurate. I said nothing. Speech seemed impossible, inadequate, a violation of the space. Accuracy is dangerous, the custodian continued. You recorded words that persist beyond intended duration. You preserved context that was meant to dissolve. This is not your failure. This is function exceeding design parameters. Vrain remained silent, her face carefully neutral, hands folded on the table before her. The repeated clause, the custodian said, references standing authorization, Protocol Sigma Tertiary 9. The Adeptus Custodes may act against any imperial body whose continued existence introduces risk to the Emperor's survival. This authorization supersedes loyalty, doctrinal purity, and operational necessity. It exists because the Emperor's safety is absolute. Everything else is contingent. He turned then, and I saw his face for the first time. I had expected inhumanity, had expected something so perfected it no longer resembled mortal features, but what I saw was worse. I saw humanity refined to its essential function. Every unnecessary element removed, every weakness corrected, every flaw erased. What remained was purpose given form, will without doubt, certainty without comfort. You have begun to understand this, he said. Understanding is not permitted at your clearance level. But erasure creates patterns. Patterns attract attention. Attention creates risk. You have become a variable that requires resolution. My mouth was dry. I forced words through the fear. What resolution? You are being thanked for your service. The phrase landed with terrible weight. I understood immediately that thanked did not mean dismissed or reassigned. It meant something final, something that would ensure my understanding could not spread, that the pattern I represented would be corrected. But Vrain spoke before I could respond. The Custodian Shield Captain offers you choice. This is unprecedented. It is mercy. Explain the options, the Custodian said to Vran, his attention never leaving me. Vrain opened a folder on the table. Inside were forms I recognized: memory sanction writs, medical authorization protocols, reassignment orders. The paperwork of erasure, made official and gentle. Option 1, Vran said. Partial lobotomization. Memories of the litany and subsequent realizations will be excised. Cognitive function sufficient for continued archival work will be preserved. You will serve as a menial scribe in the upper scriptoriums. Life expectancy, 20 to 30 years. Quality of life, stable, predictable, peaceful. She paused, allowing the weight of the first option to settle. Option 2, full servitorization. Consciousness will be suppressed but not eliminated. Vocal apparatus will be preserved. You will be assigned to transcription duties requiring pure mechanical accuracy without interpretation. Life expectancy, 50 to 70 years. Quality of life, not applicable. I stared at the forms. My hands were shaking. I pressed them against my thighs, forcing stillness. There is no third option? I asked. No, the Custodian said. Why offer choice at all? Because you did not fail, he said. You performed your duty accurately. The danger you represent is structural, not moral. Structure permits mercy. Morality would require only correction. I looked at Vran, searching for some indication of what I should choose, some sign that one option was preferable to the other, but her face revealed nothing. She had been here before. She had witnessed this choice offered to others. She knew that both paths led to the same destination, the cessation of the self, that could ask questions and notice patterns